Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press, and this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories ever covered by the Associated Press in its 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Over the weekend, the United States passed Italy as the nation with the most deaths caused by COVID-19, now more than 20,000. There was some good news, though. The daily death total dropped substantially from around 2,000 at a high last week to just under 1,500 on Sunday. Around the world, countries are starting to grapple with the idea of loosening restrictions that have stemmed the spread of the virus, but have suffocated their local economies. Leanne Italie is my guest today. She covers entertainment and lifestyle for the Associated Press. She wrote a story that posted to The Wire earlier this week with the headline, "A Pandemic in Sound." How has the pandemic changed the way the world sounds for so many people? Leanne writes, the routine cacophony of daily life has calmed, lending more weight to the noises left behind. And in those mundane sounds, now so unexpectedly bared, many have found comfort, hope, and dread. As someone who lives in New York City, Brooklyn to be specific, less than a mile from a hospital, I can tell you the sound of sirens from emergency vehicles has never been so prevalent. It is frequent and, frankly, a little unsettling. Leanne, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about the sounds of a pandemic.
Thanks for having me.
To draw back the curtain a bit for those listening, Leanne and I had a nice conversation a couple of days ago to talk about this story because even as she said, it's a little more conceptual than a lot of the hard news we tend to cover. After speaking to you, though, I realized that this story really isn't all that different from a lot of the stories we have been covering in the pandemic. It's sort of what has been taken from us and what has stepped up to take its place. So let's start with that very big picture question, Leanne. What sounds have we lost and what has replaced them?
Exactly. I mean, I think the key point here in terms of what we're all hearing as well as feeling is this shared experience in sound throughout the world. And we all know about the sirens, people in urban areas as well as rural areas and suburban areas, usually tune out sirens. Now there's a foreboding, especially in New York. Anytime we hear sirens, which we're hearing with increased frequency due to our experiences on 9/11. A lot of people I spoke with are connecting those sirens to that day and listening, which is something that we don't routinely do. There's bird song everywhere from Wuhan to Paris to Berlin. Everybody's talking about the bird song. They're paying attention to the birds. Obviously, there's no difference in migratory patterns of birds. The birds have always been there, but people are looking up and seeking comfort from that sound. There are the church bells that are still ringing, and people from all faiths are connecting with those just to take a pause and to just listen. I've spoken to many people who are just listening, and there are more personal sounds too, sounds that we're hearing in our homes that we've never heard before, or we're hearing out our windows that we've never heard before. So it's quite a shared experience.
Well, let me get to some of those personal stories and some of the details. You mentioned a list of sounds there. And obviously the siren sound is something that's been very prevalent in New York. But you talked to an AP photographer in Washington State who was covering one of the very first hotspots at a nursing home. And he shared a story with you about the way sirens became part of his life and reporting.
Yeah, his name is Ted Warren, and he spent days and days standing out in front of the Life Care Center in Kirkland, which was the epicenter in this country, in the U.S., where 129 people were sickened and many died. I believe it was a third of their resident population died of the virus. And he met a lot of people. He met families who were standing out there. He knew what specific patients were in specific windows. The nursing home is on top of a hill off of a busy street. And anytime a siren came along, they would listen to see whether it was coming up the hill. And his first thought was, please don't let it be a family that I know. He went back many days later to take some follow-up photos, and he was already geared to listening for those sirens. And as he shot, he realized there was nothing but silence until a siren in the distance started to sound, and his heart raced because he wondered whether that particular ambulance would be coming up the hill. In fact, it did not. It passed the nursing home, and that's when he realized things had changed there for Life Care Center.
So you also spoke to a couple of people, I believe, who were visually impaired, living in big cities. For someone who relies so much on their hearing, how has the world been impacted by the sort of the sounds of silence being brought on by the pandemic?
Yes, I did. I wanted to specifically get that experience, and I went to a 58-year-old man in San Francisco. He lives in the Tenderloin district. He lives alone. He is a massage therapist and a musician who's not obviously getting out. His business is dried up. And he was very disturbed by what he was hearing for the first time, and a lot of times missing what he wasn't hearing. So he was attuned to ambient noise. We all have a sound floor, right? We all have a soundscape that we're used to, but visually impaired people are more reliant on those oral cues, and he is one of them. So he lives on top of a bakery. He lives next to a restaurant. The bakery remained open, is open. The restaurant closed. And when the restaurant closed, a ventilator fan from the restaurant that he was used to hearing as his white noise, a soothing sound, was gone. And all of these other sounds came flooding into his brain. And that includes conversations in buildings around him, in his own building. It's a 6-unit building that he never heard before. All of a sudden, he was hearing the doors slamming more intensely from the bakery below. And it completely changed the way that he navigates the world, whether he's inside or on a short walk, which is he was doing. I spoke to another woman who's near a big city. She's in Stony Brook on Long Island here in New York. She lives near a level 3 trauma center hospital where she was also hearing the sirens. And then all of a sudden, after a few days, she didn't hear the sirens and wondered, does that mean the hospital is full? Does that mean people are not getting treated? So there's an emotional connection, not only to sirens, but to many of the sounds that we're hearing. We're attaching emotions. We're processing sound very emotionally in this time of pandemic.
So I'm guessing in many communities, they are hearing church bells, or maybe it should be better said that they are noticing the church bells more than they have in a while. But you had uncovered there's a certain significance to church bells, both now and historically tied to outbreaks.
Yes, I found it fascinating. Obviously, people of all faiths have come to me and said, do you hear those bells? I mean, the bells are still there. They are noticing, if not processing, if not connecting in a faith-based way. So I went to a church bell historian from The Ohio State University. His name is Isaac Weiner, and he's written a book on religion and sound. And he outlined for me the history of church bells through the centuries. And it was fascinating to me that in the early centuries of the Christian church, when Christianity was a persecuted minority sect in the Roman Empire, around the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, there was no tradition of church bells because the Christian sect, the Christian community, was trying to fly under the radar. They were looking not to draw attention to themselves. They were looking for a quieter, more clandestine mode to collect their congregants for services and other functions. And that changed, obviously, as Christianity was accepted. So the use of church bells gradually developed from monasteries and cathedrals to every parish church in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. By the 10th and 11th centuries, it was pretty widespread, but that became a source of power for what faith was in power in a community. There were disputes between Presbyterians and the Catholic Church in terms of who can ring bells. And this carried through all the way to modern day, through the industrial age, when mosques started to draw controversy for their call to prayer. While not bells, it's a human male voice that calls Muslims to prayer. There were disputes over the noise of the call to prayer, and many towns as late as 2003 grappled with that, including a small town in Michigan called Hamtramck, which had quite the controversy, where the city council actually supported a mosque who wanted to amplify its call to prayer and said, yes, you can do that. We will take that on a case-by-case, complaint-by-complaint basis. It caused a lot of ruckus in 2003 there in Hamtramck.
Before I go into my last question, I would say that if there are any Ohio State alums listening, they would love the fact that you emphasized the before the Ohio State University. I know they take a lot of pride in that. Let's try to end this on a somewhat of a happy note, if that's possible. So my wife likes to bird watch. She hasn't had much opportunity to do that these days because she works in public health. But for some bird watchers, the changing soundscape has provided an opportunity to find comfort in their hobby.
Absolutely. Not only bird watchers, but absolutely. I was on the street the other day, and a 4-year-old girl walking with her parents stopped conversation between the three of them and said, look, Mama, look, pointed up to a tree. Look at the birds. What 4-year-old distracted in this day and age would even have noticed that prior to this health crisis? But I do know bird watchers, avid bird watchers in Central Park here in New York, and they are filling up their logs and happily sharing what they're hearing, and they're listening in a different way, even as attuned bird watchers, and they're coming up with all sorts of bird call for their logs and birds for their logs that perhaps they would have missed in a different time.
Leanne Italie, entertainment writer, lifestyle writer for the Associated Press. Leanne, thank you so much for sharing this story and sharing your insight with us. Please stay healthy and safe.
Thanks, you too.
Today at apnews.com, our One Good Thing takes a look at how in Nepal, the people are coming together to take care of hundreds of animals, monkeys, cows, and pigeons that normally get their meals from the devotees at one of the country's most revered Hindu temples in Kathmandu. After temples closed to stop the spread of coronavirus, people were forbidden from leaving their homes. The animals then risked starvation. Now, every morning and evening, a few guards and about a half dozen staff and some volunteers come out to ensure that the animals survive. You can find that story and all of AP's news coverage of the coronavirus outbreak at apnews.com.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. We'll be here every step of the way during this extraordinary moment in American politics and American life, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com. From the Westwood One Podcast Network.